Good day, my friends. I hope you are indeed having a good day. I want to ask you a question. What are your plans for Thanksgiving? I don't know what's going on in your household, but in our household, we're facing the real possibility, because of this pandemic surging again, of not being all together for Thanksgiving. That's a pretty big deal for us because Thanksgiving is like our big holiday as a family, and we're going to be so disappointed if we can't be together for Thanksgiving. What do you do when you're disappointed? Like now, or many events over these last number of months during the pandemic. What do you do when you are disappointed? Well, what you do kind of depends on the disappointment itself. Is the disappointment a big deal, a critical deal for you? If not, can you accept or forget about that disappointment? For example, you might be a big fan of a sports team and your team loses the big game, and that's disappointed, but maybe it's not so critical. Can you forget about it or accept it and move on? Well, if it is a big deal, if it is critical, it leads to a second question. The second question is this: can you do something to change the disappointment? For example, you might have been disappointed because you got a poor evaluation at work or you missed a promotion. But maybe you can do something to how you work to change that in the future, to get the promotion, to get a better evaluation in the future. When it's a big deal disappointment and you can do something to change it, well then do it, change it. But if you can't change the disappointment, and it's a big deal or critical disappointment, it's going to be hard. You're going to feel feelings of maybe depression or discouragement. It'll be like you're just faint. You feel like you want to faint and fall down and slip into, just a dark pit of disappointment. Some of the disappointments that we have faced during this pandemic are like that. They're big deal disappointments and they're difficult to do anything to change. And I'm thinking as we move into the future, we might be facing a long, dark winter together because of this. If that's the case, it's going to be important to figure out, what do you do when it's a big deal disappointment and you can't do much to change it? The question is, how do you plan to cope? How do you plan to cope? When it's a big deal disappointment and it's difficult to change, that's the only questions that's left. How do you plan to cope? Now, there are many good coping strategies. If you go on the internet and Google coping strategies, you're going to get all kinds of good ways to cope. What's the way that you cope when it's a big deal disappointment and it's difficult to change? I want to invite you, as part of your coping strategy, maybe the most important part of how you cope, is to lean into your friendship with God. To remember that God is your closest friend. That's what we learn about God through Jesus, who's God in the flesh. Jesus came to be our closest friend, our best friend. And that God is working for your good, for our good in all things. That's the way God rolls. That's what we learn about God from Jesus. And one way to lean into your friendship with God is to lean into God's promises, God's word. For example, and there are many passages, but let me share you this one that I think is especially good for dealing with disappointment. Isaiah 40, verses 28 through 31. It begins with a couple questions. Have you not known? Have you not heard? In other words, hey, remember this about God. It says this: the Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. In other words, God is the most powerful, influential, effective being in the universe. He does not faint or grow weary. God doesn't become disappointed, in other words. His understanding is unsearchable. God knows what's going on inside of it to a point where it's almost unimaginable how well he understands us. He gives power to the faint. We could say he gives power to those who are disappointed. And to him who has no might, he increases strength. Even youths, I love that, even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. Being young doesn't protect us from being disappointed and feeling faint because of that. But here's the promise. But they who wait for the Lord, who shall renew their strength, they shall mount up on wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Now notice in that promise, there's nothing about God changing the situation, changing the disappointment, but rather giving us the ability to cope, to strengthen our fainting heart in the face of this disappointment, strengthening us so that we are able to cope. That's the way we cope. I think it's the most important coping strategy that we have, to lean into our friendship with God and do that by leaning into his promises in his word. The Lord is in you, dear ones, and will give you the strength to be able to cope with big deal disappointments. May that be an encouragement for you today.